All right. Hello. Hi. Welcome to Connect with Adult Ed, the NMEA podcast. I'm your host, Nadia Kager. I'm joined today for a very special episode. Of course, Jamie is here.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, and we're doing a very special episode on testing accommodations. So we have from the state office, Katya Backhaus. And Katya, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. It's so exciting to be on this podcast. I hope that I can provide you with some useful information regarding accommodations. It's always such a puzzling piece for everybody. So I am glad that I have this opportunity to share this information with you.
Oh, absolutely. So just for the sake of clarity, why don't you tell us about your title and your background and why are we talking to you? We know why we're talking to you. Well, maybe people don't know why we're talking to you. Yeah, so tell us about
you talking to me. My name is Katya Backhaus, and I'm a state high school equivalency administrator. I also happen to be the data administrator for adult education. So as the high school equivalency administrator of the state, one of my very important jobs is to make sure that people who require accommodations, who need accommodations to be successful for the high school equivalency exams, get those accommodations. Also, my very important job is to support all of the test takers, but also to support all of our adult education staff. And I think a part of the support comes down to providing all of the information that they can have, including the information on accommodations.
Oh, excellent. I know this doesn't have to do with our episode today, but could you tell us just a little bit about your background and how you got here? Because I've heard interesting things, and I think other people would also find that interesting.
I agree. Yeah. Yes.
Well, my background is, some of you probably know, I am Russian, so I was born in Russia, and that's where I started my education. And my professional education is actually, I'm a scientist. So I used to be a theoretical physicist and a mathematician as well. So I spent many years doing all different kinds of research. I did some research in nonlinear acoustics and nonlinear optics and plasma physics and all different kinds of areas. But in parallel with solving puzzling problems, which I absolutely love to do, I also spent a lot of time helping people to get better education. And while I started teaching in graduate school in UC Berkeley, I actually then migrated into teaching high school and sometimes even teaching middle school. And one of the reasons I do this is because I always feel that education is a true power. And this is how I actually started to teach in adult education as well. So my educator's career has paralleled my scientific career as well. So up until today, I actually do some research, and I also consult for Los Alamos National Laboratory. But unfortunately, I don't really teach, but my connection with education is now through my position at the state office. I hope that through my support of all high school equivalency test takers, I can actually make a difference in removing some of the barriers for our test takers, so that they feel more empowered and supported in taking high school equivalency exams.
Excellent. Really well put. And just really fascinating background and how you kind of came around and became an educator and still doing your own research. It really just speaks to kind of how adult education really does attract so many different kinds of people in different ways. And that's why I love hearing, and that's part of the reason why I love this podcast, is just, I really love hearing about just how people got here, where they come from. It's great. And thank you for sharing that. So we're just going to jump in. So our topic today is testing accommodations. So our first question is, what is the process? If a student wants accommodations for the official HSC exams, to whom should we refer them to make these arrangements? Do we talk to CNM, the testing center? Do we talk to NMHED, Adult Ed?
Well, Nadia, I'm so glad that you're asking this question, because I think the puzzling pieces of, what accommodations are and how to request them really begins with, how do I even start the process? Well, and what makes it maybe even harder is that the process is different for GED and a HiSET exam. So I would really like to share with you what to do if you would like to request accommodations for a GED exam and what you can do if you want to request accommodations for the HiSET exam. So for the GED exam, the request for accommodations is actually housed inside the GED account for the test taker. So what that means is that only test taker can actually apply for accommodations. So how does this usually look like? So the way it looks like is that, let's say the person wants to create a GED account on GED.com. They begin by typing their name, putting their date of birth, and then they're asked the question, would they like to request accommodations? If the person answers yes, then an accommodation request form immediately opens up, and then the person will fill out the request for accommodations. Then they will be prompted to add any of the appropriate supportive documentation. So that's how it works for the GED exam. Now, sometimes, as you know, some of our students might create an account and only later, sometimes even after they take the first exam, they realize that they really need some accommodations. If this is the case, GED also allows to request accommodations from, again, inside the GED account, from the profile of the person. The person will go and say that they want to edit their profile, and then the same request for accommodations form will open. So for GED exam, it all begins with the test taker. It's the test taker who requests accommodations. Now, while it is the test taker who requests the accommodation, on the accommodation request form, there are also places to provide contact information for instructors, for maybe a parent, or maybe an advocate that the test taker would like to share this information with. Now, it's very important that the test taker puts that information into the form, because otherwise all of those parents and supporters, they would not be able to actually get any information regarding their accommodations. So that's how it is for the GED exam. Now, for HiSET exam, it is slightly different. So for the HiSET exam, to request accommodations, a person needs to fill out a special accommodation request form. It's not actually attached to a HiSET account. And if the person wants to find that form, they can find it on the HiSET.org website. And there is a place that talks about accommodations, and then it says, here's a link, for the request for accommodations for HiSET exam. If somebody would like to request accommodations, cannot find the form, you can always ask me, and I'll be happy to send you the form. For the HiSET exam, it doesn't have to be a test taker who actually fills out the form. It can be a test taker, but it can also be a parent, it can be an instructor, it can be an advocate, and then they need to put one email address. So all of the information regarding the accommodations, with things like, the accommodations was actually granted, or let's say HiSET exam needs some additional documentation, all of that information will be communicated through the email that will be on the form. So it's very important to put just the correct email address on that particular form. So as you can see, the process is very different. So do you contact, let's say, CNM Testing Center? Do you contact the HED? Absolutely not. As with everything high school equivalency, what you do is that you actually communicate with the publisher, and you communicate with the publisher through the form.
All right. Wow. Yeah, that is really intricate. I feel like they need like a FAQ or something for different accommodations. But I think I forgot to say this, but we got this from this. This was one of those listener emails, right? Like we asked people. That's how we came up with these questions. So yes. People sent, yes. So we're going to speak to Katya about accommodations. What are your questions? And then people sent us stuff. So that's why it's going to sound like very specific things, because I'm reading from what people sent in. So
precisely, yes.
Yeah. So just, throwing that out there. So thank you for that. Wow. Very intricate. So our next question is, I understand that for official exams, the student may need to produce documentation. How does this work?
So all the requests for accommodations require for the person to provide supportive documentation that actually shows that the person has a ground for asking for accommodations. And this is true for both publishers. Now, what kind of documentation is required? Well, it has to be official documentation, and usually the official documentation of one of the two types. It's either documentation, like say a diagnosis or a letter from a medical professional. It can be a doctor. It can also be a psychiatrist who is helping the student, or maybe it's even a psychologist who is working with the student and did some kind of a learning assessment to see if the person is struggling with a certain type of a learning difference. But the second type of the documentation that is also acceptable is an IEP that comes from, let's say, a school where the person was enrolled. Now, important things to remember about the documentations is that whatever documentation you're providing, it has to be official, which means that it should be a documentation that comes on a letterhead. Let's say if it's a physician who is providing the documentation, it has to be on the letterhead from the physician. It has to have the test taker's name. You should have a date. It should also have the name of that medical provider. It should have a diagnosis. And then it can also contain requested accommodations. Now, this is where the situation is slightly different for GED and a HiSET exam. If for GED exam, the GED team will really only look at the diagnosis and also see if the person maybe has some different cofactors that maybe contribute to their condition, and then they will suggest accommodations. HiSET team prefers if you actually suggest that the type of accommodations that this particular test taker that would be most useful for them for the exam. Also, the another thing to remember is that, well, the documentation that you're providing should not be too old. So usually both teams, the team from GED exam and the HiSET exam prefer if your paperwork, your documentation is not older than 5 years old. However, both of the teams say that if this is the only documentation that you have and you cannot produce something else, if it is 6 or 7 years old, still send it, and then they will consider, and then they will give you their decision. However, try to produce documentation that is not more than 5 years old.
Yeah, that is good to know. But I can also see how that could be a challenge, especially if you left school many years before and you're coming back, or even coming from another country. That can be really hard to get. Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I do recall that. Like we used to have a lot of students, and I'm sure this is still the case, where they had IEPs in high school 20 years ago. So there's a really good chance that there's still something that would require an accommodation, but getting that updated documentation can be more difficult.
So unfortunately, the 20-year-old letter, an IEP letter from the school probably would not guarantee that the accommodations will actually be granted to the person, unfortunately. But there are other ways around it, right? So officially, those are two kinds of the documentation that is required by both publishers. Now, both GED and HiSET say that if it is impossible for the test taker to produce documentation, there are some other ways, other things that the person can try to do, which of course should be the very last resort. So here's what they say. GED says that what you can do is you can write, the instructor can actually write a letter where they would describe the condition of the person, and this particular letter might be taking into account in the decision-making process of granting accommodations. HiSET exam is actually more explicit regarding those letters. They call them educators' supportive letters, and they say that this is a perfectly fine documentation. Now, they say that they still prefer documentation from a medical provider, but if it's something that's impossible to get, then the educator's letter will be perfectly acceptable. Now, if you are one of those educators who are writing this letter, I want you to remember that how you write this letter can actually make a huge difference in that accommodations request decision. So here are the things that I would suggest and recommend. Again, try to write it on the letterhead of your adult education program. Make sure you describe the current condition and what you've noticed about your student and how accommodations can really be helpful for the student. Also, what's very, very useful is include information about your own experience. with working with students who require accommodations. So talk about different professional learning courses that you maybe took for serving students with special needs. Talk about maybe some classes that you did with Propel, or special trainings that you did with Propel, or maybe some special education classes that you actually took. So if you actually have this kind of experience, that would be wonderful to include in the letter. You can also include your years of experience and how many different students with different learning needs you served.
Wow. I'm thinking about the knowledge that you would need to write this letter, just from going off what you said. So you would have to have probably a couple years of experience. You said like classes. You've also mentioned your experience with the student specifically. So I'm thinking of like, hypothetically, if you're someone who probably teaches a 30 plus size class, it might be harder to write this letter. If you don't have the language to describe working with the student in a way that can convey that knowledge is also challenging. Like if I was teaching, because I don't have an education background, I was teaching HSC and I was teaching myself. And as far as I remember, we had very limited access to trainings. I mean, this is before Propel. Trainings, as well as working with students who have disabilities. So I'm just thinking of those people, like that is a challenge. And
absolutely. Absolutely. But at the same time, I am very grateful that HiSET exam allows this pathway to requesting accommodations, because I know that getting the official documentation from especially the medical provider can be very, very challenging for our students. This is why I'm very grateful, that we have this option. And I also think that maybe it kind of gives us some ideas of what Propel can offer to some of our practitioners, maybe having some professional learning opportunities on serving students with disabilities and serving students with different learning styles, and serving students that really would require certain types of accommodations, and the types of accommodations that are available would be very, very useful for our practitioners.
Boy, you read my mind there, Katya. I was just thinking the same thing. How can Propel support instructors in having the tools that they need to be able to do this? Because you are right. This is an amazing option, especially in areas that are more rural, that do not have the professionals who can provide those diagnoses for these students. I really am excited for that opportunity for Propel to support teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't mean to speak to the barriers. It is a great option. I'm just thinking of it in terms of an individual instructor. I would say that that's something that could be in-house training for organizations, where everyone has these very basic, here's some screening tools, here's how to identify certain behaviors or barriers, here's how you write about this. This is having maybe some sort of template of like, here's the letterhead, here's how you address HiSET, like stuff like that. Like there are ways administratively that program can support instructors in this way, where it's not just on them. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. And maybe another thing that can be added to this is some special training for the practitioners that will tell them what kind of conditions would actually guarantee a certain type of accommodations, knowing what accommodations are available and what accommodations are usually granted for different kinds of conditions. Just because, remember, even if the practitioner is very experienced and if the letter is written really well, if they're asking for some accommodations that are usually not granted for specific conditions, then what will happen is, unfortunately, that particular request will be denied. So I just think that kind of providing more information to our practitioners would be very, very useful.
Oh, absolutely. And that is something that Propel has been talking about in different ways. So where can students go to get tested in order to receive their official diagnosis for accommodation requests? I understand students need this documentation in order to request accommodations.
Well, this is a great, great question. So, of course, a test taker can go to the medical provider. It all depends on the kind of accommodations they would like and what is a specific condition that they're struggling with. So first of all, they can go to the regular medical provider and ask them for a letter. By the way, the letter is required for any kind of medical condition. For example, for GED, even somebody is, let's say, blind, they still need a letter from the medical provider saying that the person is actually blind. So now, in addition to going to the medical provider, the person can also go to a social worker or psychologist and ask them to maybe do a special educational assessment just to see if there's any kind of learning disability that the person has. Now, very often what I hear from test takers who actually come from general public, and they often call me and they say, where can I possibly go? I do not have a medical provider and I do not have a psychologist. So what do I do in this case? Well, to get tested, you can also contact DVR, Department of Vocational Rehabilitation, and they actually provide services to all New Mexicans who require this kind of assessments. Now, we in the state office are trying to establish a better working relationship with the DVR so that we can actually have a referral process. We've been working on this for a while, and we're hoping that within the next 6 months, we will be able to have this referral process where the person can come to us, say that they would really like to have this kind of educational assessment, and then we can immediately refer them to DVR, and this particular testing can actually take place. Now, in the meantime, before we can have a good referral process with the DVR, we also have yet another option for people. We actually contract some of the psychologists. So what we do is if a person really, really needs this kind of assessment, what they can do is they can contact me and I will refer this person to a psychologist who will do their assessment. Now, the unfortunate thing is those assessments are very, very expensive. The majority of the assessments cost over $1,000, but we already have some of the people that we refer to them and we paid for the services. So if worse comes to worse, if you do not have the appropriate documentation, if, let's say, the instructor or your advocate cannot write that educator letter, then we can always do the assessment for you. We can refer you to the psychologist and we will pay for your exam.
Wow.
That is a really great resource. I mean, despite the cost, and the cost is unfortunately a prohibitive thing. That's a really great resource. I had no idea.
Yes, what I do is that I actually have been looking for different graduates who are doing their internships in the state. And as soon as we have a new one, I usually grab them and I ask them if they would like to do this for us. So we have a wonderful, wonderful graduate right now who lives in the state who is willing to provide those services to our students and test takers.
That's absolutely incredible. It's really great to just hear what's going on in adult ed in New Mexico, because I feel like sometimes we just don't have these settings to really just, obviously things are going on. You guys are real busy at the state office, but we don't always know what's happening. And it's really exciting to hear that and have this space to just ask you these questions, Katya. So again, I just appreciate your time because this is such good information. It's really incredible how much change has been happening in adult ed in the last few years, especially in New Mexico. It's really incredible. This interview will continue on the next part of this episode. Thank you for listening to the NMEA podcast. Connect with Adult Ed, the NMEA podcast, is a project of the Propel Professional Learning System and is funded by the New Mexico Higher Education Department's Adult Education Division. Thank you for listening.